Yo creo que puedes tirar tú delante, Miguel, adelante, no hace falta.
Però no us sembla? Hòstia, és que el tio també... Sí, ens ha fotut el treball.
De acuerdo. Bueno, pues voy a intervenir en español para presentar a nuestra invitada de hoy. Heather Hall es una persona que ha trabajado como experta en desarrollo local y regional, sobre todo desarrollo económico, planificación, políticas. Es profesora asistente, como habréis visto en la reseña, de la Universidad de Waterloo en Ontario, y dirige el máster de Desarrollo Económico e Innovación. Ha publicado trabajos, resultado de su investigación acerca de la experiencia de la lente rural canadiense, y esto de alguna manera nos ha servido de gancho para ponernos en contacto con ella, aparte de por el hecho de ser una persona, por decirlo así, activista, en tanto que pertenece a la Fundación por la Revitalización Rural Canadiense. Ponernos en contacto con la doctora Hall de alguna manera se debe también a la inspiración de un compañero mío en el Centro de Estudios sobre Despoblación y Desarrollo de Áreas Rurales, el profesor y amigo Luis Antonio Sáez, quien incidía en un aspecto del sistema canadiense de garantía rural, y era precisamente en la denominación, la lente rural canadiense, y de alguna manera incidía en la importancia de las palabras para aportar una visión de lo que realmente significa o cuál es el enfoque adoptado en Canadá, que es el de lente, el de la mirada rural, esa fuerza de la palabra. De alguna manera, pues yo la aprendí hace 20 años leyéndole este cuento a mi hija, que es Palabras Mágicas, y en donde tomé conciencia de que todas las palabras son mágicas, porque todas ellas imprimen efectos insospechados en las personas y en el entorno que nos rodea. Bueno, después de esta licencia poética, doy la palabra a la doctora Hall para que nos hable de la experiencia canadiense de garantía rural de la legislación. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Miguel. And if it's okay, I will share my screen and put some slides up. Everyone can see that? Excellent. Well, thank you for the invitation to share with you some insights on rural proofing in Canada. As Miguel said in the introduction, I am an assistant professor and the academic director for the Masters of Economic Development and Innovation program at the University of Waterloo. Most of my research focuses on local and regional economic development, planning, policy, and practice here in Canada. But I also look at, more specifically, innovation in rural and northern regions, the community impacts of labor mobility and large-scale resource development projects, and the impacts of disruptive technologies on economic development and the future of work in rural communities. With regards to rural proofing, I conducted research in 2016 with my colleague Ryan Gitson at the University of Guelph on rural proofing in Canada for the Swedish Agency for Growth Policy Analysis as part of a parliamentary review they were doing on rural areas. I also recently published a commentary for the Northern Policy Institute here in Canada on whether the province of Ontario, which is where I'm located, needs a Northern policy lens. And finally, I am a member of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, as Miguel mentioned, which is a national nonprofit that was established in 1989 to contribute to the revitalization and sustainability of rural Canada through collaborative research for rural leaders in the community, private sector, and in all levels of government. I'm really excited to share with you some of the insights of this work on Canada's approach to rural proofing and to hear about the work you're currently undertaking in Spain. And I see a hand up. Is that for me? No? Okay. To situate ourselves, I thought we should start with a bit of context on rural Canada. From a geographic perspective, Canada is an extremely vast country with a comparatively small population. We have roughly 35 million people spread out over 9 million square kilometers. When we look at rural Canada, we do not have a single official definition for rural, but the most commonly used definitions include the rural and small town or the non-metropolitan area. The rural and small town Canada definition includes people living outside the commuting zone of larger urban centers, and it includes communities with a population of under 10,000 people. Based on this definition, roughly 18% of Canadians live in rural and small towns. Another commonly used definition includes non-metropolitan area, which are all communities that are not a census metropolitan area or communities with a population under 100,000 people. Based on this definition, roughly 31% of Canadians live in a non-metropolitan area or in a rural community. What unifies our various definitions of rural in Canada are two key elements: distance and density. So rural communities are often defined based on their distance to a larger urban center and their lack of population density or lower population density, which I think is fairly similar to how you're measuring rural in Spain. We know that rural Canada contributes roughly 30% to Canada's GDP. However, the vast geography of rural Canada translates into multiple rural realities based on location, the economy, history, and culture, for example. The historic and contemporary economy of rural Canada continues to be focused on the extraction of natural resources, such as timber or forestry, minerals, fish, and agriculture. This often leads to what we call boom-bust cycles of economic growth. These sectors have also gone through economic restructuring over the last few decades, which has resulted in industry closures and shifts in employment. Many rural communities across Canada are also struggling with youth outmigration and aging populations, leading to population decline. And due to shifting political and policy priorities, as well as austerity measures, many rural communities are confronted with infrastructure and service deficits, like access to quality and affordable broadband, which has certainly been a major challenge during the pandemic. That being said, rural Canada is also home to many of the key industries that support our livelihoods, like food production and energy generation. Rural Canada is also rich in natural amenities, and many rural communities have a strong quality of place and a vibrant social sector. When we look at rural development in Canada, both the federal and the provincial and territorial governments have created programs and policies. But today I'll spend most of my time discussing a federal or a national approach to rural proofing called the Rural Secretariat and its rural lens. The Federal Rural Secretariat was created in 1996 by our national government, and it was designed to bring the various government departments together around rural issues and priorities to promote dialogue between rural Canadians and the federal government. It evolved during a time when many rural communities faced economic challenges, including the collapse of the cod fishery in Atlantic Canada and restructuring in the mining and the forestry sectors. Politically at that time, the federal government had very little visibility in rural Canada, and the governing party lacked a strong rural base. The Federal Rural Secretariat was housed within the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which was a sectoral line department, and it primarily used the rural and small town definition for decision-making programs and policies. Despite being in the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, it focused on all sectors of the economy. In 1998, the Canadian Rural Partnership was announced in the federal budget. It was a horizontal policy initiative that empowered the Rural Secretariat with a mandate and funding. And in 1999, the Prime Minister appointed a Secretary of State for Rural Development to assist the Rural Secretariat with its mandate, and an interdepartmental working group on rural was also used to promote horizontal coordination across departments. The Rural Secretariat operated until 2013, when the governing party did not renew its mandate. Over its lifetime, a number of initiatives were introduced through the Rural Secretariat and the Canadian Rural Partnership to promote rural development. This included the Rural Lens, which we will discuss in more detail on some following slides, a rural dialogue process, which was carried out across the country to hear directly from rural Canadians on local and regional issues, challenges, and priorities, a pilot projects initiative, which funded creative approaches to community development in rural and remote Canada that contributed to at least one of the 11 rural priorities in the federal framework for action in rural Canada, a rural and small town Canada analysis bulletin, which resulted from a partnership with Statistics Canada, our national statistics agency, to generate critical and timely data for rural communities on issues, trends, opportunities, and challenges. And a Models for Rural Development initiative, which was created in 2003 to identify, test, and evaluate various approaches to addressing rural development issues, as well as a national rural research network that brought together policy and research practitioners from across Canada in partnership with the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. There were a number of other initiatives introduced by the Rural Secretariat and policy frameworks created to support rural Canada during this time. All of these activities had an impact on federal rural policy, but we will look specifically at the Rural Lens as one of the main tools for rural proofing in Canada. If you're not familiar with the term policy lens, it's a tool that is used to develop or review existing policies, programs, legislation, and or other government practices based on a particular theme, which in this case is rural. Typically, it is a set of questions that serve as a checklist to guide and evaluate these decisions. The Rural Lens in Canada was first created in 1998 as a tool to review federal policies and programs from the perspectives of people living in rural and remote communities. It was designed to be applied early in the development of a program or policy by all federal departments when developing their programs and policies. The Rural Secretariat was available as a resource to assist those departments with implementing and using the Rural Lens. However, it is worth noting that there was no legislation that required other departments within the federal government to apply the Rural Lens, and no penalties or sanctions if the Rural Lens was not applied. When the Rural Lens was first released, it included a checklist of rural considerations. And this checklist included the following questions. The first question was, how is this initiative relevant to rural Canada? The second question is the impact specific to a selected rural or remote environment or region? Have the most likely positive and negative effects on rural Canada been identified, and where relevant, addressed? Another question that they were asked is this initiative designed to respond to the priorities identified by rural Canadians? Have rural Canadians been consulted during the development or modification of this initiative? And finally, how is the benefit to rural Canadians maximized? Is there cooperation with other partners, the development of local solutions for local challenges, and flexibility for decision-making? So these questions served as the checklist that all government departments should have been using at that time to help guide their policy and program development. In 2001, the Rural Secretariat went one step further and created a guide to using the Rural Lens to help promote the adoption of the lens by various federal government departments. And their guide included 10 stages, which we will discuss in a bit more detail. So the first stage is the conceptual phase, where a government department defines the initiative or the policy or program. while stage 2 included an environmental scan and an impact assessment. More specifically, it had government departments or policymakers consider the following questions. How is this initiative relevant to rural and remote Canada? Is it specific to a particular rural or remote region? What are the potential financial and economic impacts on rural and remote regions? What are the potential social impacts? What are the potential environmental impacts? What are the potential cultural impacts? And how can the effects on rural and remote regions be measured? After completing the environmental scan and the impact assessment, policymakers were also asked to identify people and organizations that need to be involved or require consultation. The fourth stage included developing and designing the initiative based on information from the previous stages. And stage 5 included communicating through appropriate channels to reach rural and remote Canadians, while stage 6 validated the initiative through consultations if needed. In stage 7, it included refining the initiative to reflect rural realities gained from the consultations, while stage 8 sought approval for the initiative from Cabinet. And finally, stage 9 and 10 were to deliver the program and ideally monitor and evaluate that program. Again, the rural lens was a tool to help design federal policies and programs taking into account the perspectives or realities of people living in rural and remote regions across the country. They ended up creating a rural lens unit within the Rural Secretariat, which initially started with 1 employee. And by the time the Rural Secretariat was canceled, it had eventually grown to include 8 employees. So not that large, given that they were supposed to be looking at all policies and programs across the federal government. The Rural Lens Unit reviewed all draft policies and programs, and they would submit a report to the sponsoring government department on how their policy or program could be improved to better reflect rural and remote realities. It's worth noting that the sponsoring government department, so whichever government department was creating a new policy or program, had no responsibility to report back to the Rural Secretariat on how they implemented this feedback. Unfortunately, the rural lens was also often applied to a policy or program after it had been developed instead of during its development. And it would essentially be sent to the rural lens unit when it was seeking approval from Cabinet versus in those early stages. During its lifetime, the successful application of the rural lens did lead to a number of new initiatives for rural communities. This included funding dedicated for rural infrastructure, the establishment of an Office of Rural Health in the Department of Health. Access to the federal government was also improved through increased Service Canada locations across the country. The Community Futures program received additional investment, and Community Future Development Corporations expanded to include additional communities. And the Rural Secretariat and the Rural Lens were also instrumental in facilitating the creation of Industry Canada's Broadband for Rural and Northern Development pilot program. However, we also know that a number of challenges were encountered. First was the location of the Rural Secretariat and the Rural Lens in a sectoral line department focused on agriculture. This meant that rural was often seen as equivalent to the agricultural sector. Second, the Rural Secretariat, as a unit within a line department, had no authority to really enforce that horizontal coordination or the use of the rural lens despite its mandate. Instead, it relied on an active Secretary of State and later a minister to use moral persuasion on other departments to apply the rural lens and think about the impacts on rural Canada. Third, the Rural Secretariat and Rural Lens Unit had an extremely small number of employees and limited financial resources, which leads to capacity issues. And finally, much of the success of the Rural Lens Unit and the Rural Secretariat occurred behind the scenes, and there were no official reporting mechanisms in place to track success. Drawing on Canada's experience with the rural lens and other international examples in Ireland and England, we can highlight a number of lessons for using policy lenses like a rural lens. First, any policy lens requires a strong champion within government to encourage buy-in across government. In the Canadian case, this was an active Secretary of State or minister. Second, where the policy lens is housed matters. In the Canadian context, the Rural Secretariat and Rural Lens were housed within the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, which presented several challenges for implementation. If the Rural Lens had been housed within a central unit of government, it could have had the authority to promote policy coordination across government and shed the agricultural equals rural perception. Third, a policy lens without authority becomes a tick box or a checkbox exercise. It is clear from the Canadian case and other international examples that a rural lens requires legislative authority, or it becomes a suggested practice, or a simple checkbox exercise within government. Fourth, if the policy lens is to be applied effectively, strong financial and human resources are required. A policy lens also requires reliable, accessible, and coordinated data to support its application. One of the strengths of the Federal Rural Secretariat in Canada was its partnership with Statistics Canada to create the Rural and Small Town Canada Analysis Bulletin. This provided critical and timely data on rural issues, trends, opportunities, and challenges. Ideally, a policy lens tool and process should be developed in partnership with impacted communities. In addition, an engagement framework should be developed to determine when impacted communities should be engaged during implementation. A sixth lesson is that a policy lens should be seen in action versus behind the scenes, with few details made public on operations and outcomes. This could take the form of a publicly available report covering the application of the lens and its outcomes, as well as success stories profiled online and promoted publicly. And finally, a policy lens requires what we call a formal watchdog responsible for monitoring and evaluating the quality of its application and implementation. This will ensure that the policy lens is being applied consistently and effectively. As noted earlier, the Federal Rural Secretariat was not renewed in 2013, which led to its demise and the demise of the rural lens. But we do have a number of current approaches for rural proofing in Canada. In 2019, a Minister for Rural Economic Development was named by the governing party, and later a Centre for Rural Economic Development was created within Infrastructure Canada at the national level. We have heard that they are in the process of reviving the rural lens, but we have not seen anything officially. Across the country, many provinces also have ministries or departments with rural mandates and ministers. The provincial government in Newfoundland and Labrador is one of the only governments that currently has an active rural lens within the Public Engagement and Planning Division, and we'll look at its rural lens in a moment. A rural municipal association in the province of Ontario also has a rural and northern lens, which has at times been used by the provincial government in Ontario, and we will look at their tool as well. With regards to the rural lens in Newfoundland and Labrador, it was designed to encourage government departments to identify intended, unintended, and disproportionate or differential impacts of proposed cabinet decisions on rural citizens stakeholders, and communities. To help determine these impacts, the following 3 questions are asked when developing programs or policies. The first is, will the decision or proposed policy direction directly impact, either positively or negatively, the economic, demographic, and or social circumstances of communities, stakeholders, and or citizens within or across rural regions? And if yes, how? The second question is, will the decision or proposed policy direction indirectly impact, positively or negatively, the economic, demographic, and or social circumstances of communities, stakeholders, and or citizens within or across rural communities? If yes, how? And the third question is, will the decision or policy being considered disproportionately affect smaller or remote rural communities when compared to larger ones? And if so, how? The other rural lens is the Rural and Northern Lens in Ontario, which was created in 2006 by the Northern and Rural Working Group of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario to address what they saw as a one-size-fits-all approach to policymaking in the province. The lens was established to guide provincial ministries through the development of new policies and programs or changes to existing ones to ensure that the needs and realities of rural northern communities were considered and addressed. The lens was updated in 2011 and 2015 and includes the following questions. Does the proposed initiative benefit or hinder the fiscal realities of rural Northern Ontario? Does it have a business case that accounts for low and sparse populations? Does it enhance opportunities in rural Northern Ontario? Does it help or hinder goals of sustainability, blending environmental, social, and economic factors? Does it consider how and if rural people will be able to access it? Does it consider all options for delivery, ensuring efficiency, the potential for co-delivery, and an acceptable administrative impact on municipalities? They also ask whether it accounts for the needs of special populations, such as youth, elderly, and immigrants. Does it have adequate human and financial resources to be effective? Does it ensure that rural and northern communities are receiving equitable treatment or services relative to others in the province? Does it recognize the geography, weather, and scale of rural and northern Ontario and include adjusted program criteria to accommodate these realities? Does it accommodate the aspirations of residents from rural communities and the north? And does it build upon the input and advice of rural residents, communities, and municipalities? So again, it's a series of questions to help guide the development of policies and programs. And one thing I like about this lens in particular is that it has this visual matrix for ranking answers as positive, neutral, or negative by assigning each question a score between -4 and +4. And this provides a really quick and effective visual representation of the benefits and shortcomings of an initiative with regards to the needs and the realities of rural communities. So you'll see the rankings on the left-hand side and then each of the questions located on the bottom. And that just helps provide, I think, an additional tool to implementing those questions in practice. So that's the end of my presentation this afternoon. And I think I've left some time here for questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I'm happy to share the slides as well, and there's some additional resources that I can send that can be sent out and shared with the group.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Hart. Y bueno, realmente yo me he quedado bastante impresionado por la cantidad de enseñanzas que podemos extraer aquí acerca de la experiencia canadiense. Habíamos tenido un anticipo a través de otras intervinientes que hemos tenido y de otras fuentes sobre las que hemos estado hablando en este grupo, que hoy está muy reducido, ciertamente, pero que tendrá acceso, sin duda, a esta intervención suya a través de nuestro propio circuito de comunicación. Como digo, la cantidad de experiencias vienen a confirmar toda una serie de aspectos críticos que habíamos identificado en la experiencia de otros países, en concreto del Reino Unido, en el caso también de Finlandia y de Suecia, y en definitiva nos ponen en una mejor posición para acertar en nuestra propuesta. Por contextualizar un poco mejor, aunque tuve ocasión de hacerlo a través del correo electrónico, este grupo tiene la misión de plantear a las autoridades españolas, tanto las autoridades de la administración central como a las administraciones territoriales y locales, la necesidad de incorporar mecanismos de garantía en su legislación para que el medio rural no se vea afectado negativamente por una lente, hoy por hoy, que inconscientemente es sistemáticamente urbana, y en España urbano significa además de gran ciudad, de gran urbe, a gran escala, y hoy por hoy carecemos, ya le adelanto esto, siquiera de una tentativa, ¿no?, de poner en marcha este tipo de mecanismo. Yo, en cualquier caso, entre los muchos aspectos que me llaman la atención, está la de, parece que hay un eterno conflicto entre la metodología, por decirlo así, del cuestionario, la metodología teórica racional, y por otra parte la visión orientada al resultado final, para lo cual, como bien ha señalado, la evaluación es muy importante, pero en la cual casi sistemáticamente todos los casos que hemos conocido encontraban ahí un aspecto crítico. ¿Tiene, de acuerdo con esa experiencia, la doctora Hall, alguna opinión acerca de cómo ligar de manera óptima esa rendición de cuentas o esa evaluación de resultado y su retroalimentación hacia el cuestionario inicial?
Great, thank you. Yes, I think certainly there's often a disconnect between the theory and the practice. And certainly what we've seen with the rural lens, whether it was in Canada or if we look at international examples in Ireland and England, is that it really needs that authority, so that legislative piece that requires it first and foremost. If there is no requirement to use it, then most government departments are not going to use it, especially in those initial stages of development of their policy. And then I think in the actual process, and whether that's built into the questions, the checklist, or whether that's in the broader process, is that need to evaluate and monitor how the rural lens is being implemented by government departments. And that's a really key piece that's often been missing. I think they're trying to do that now in Ireland, where there is a reporting mechanism in place and annual reports that track how the lens has been, the rural proofing mechanism there has been used. And that's where we have that recommendation for needing those annual reports to highlight when it's been used, celebrating those success stories, and making that as publicly available as possible, which I think if you've got those two pieces, the authority to actually require it to be conducted, and then that monitoring piece built into the process, then that will help that disconnect.
Muchas gracias. No sé si alguien desea plantear alguna cuestión o hacer algún comentario. Sí, Alfred.
Yes, if I can. Thank you, Dr. Hall. Really very nice presentation. A lot of information, as Miguel was saying. We were really impressed, and it's going to be very helpful for us. So we're going to share with all our teams here in Spain. We can be talking and discussing about this for hours, but I'm very practical. And I was really captured by the rural and northern land, Roma. And I saw that you present this matrix, this visual matrix at the end, with this -4, added 4, and then the different items. And I saw in your comments that you say it also was updated in 2011, 2015. But I don't know if you have it on hand, or I can check it in the web later on, any example of this graphic representation, because it would be very nice for us, no? Because I suppose, I don't know if you have it here, or if not, I'll look it later on in the web.
I don't have one, and I'm trying to think back if the original document applies it. I'll definitely look to see if it is, and if not, I can also send you the contact information of one of the researchers who was involved in creating it. I believe it was Wayne Caldwell, who's at the University of Guelph. So I can check and see if he has some examples of that in practice. That one, they created it ideally to be used within the provincial government. It has at times been applied mainly within the one rural ministry that has rural as part of its mandate, but it hasn't consistently been used across. But I do like that visual tool, and we'll certainly see if I can find an example of it being used.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Muy bien, ¿más preguntas o comentarios? A mí me permito volver a entrar. Me llamó mucho la atención el énfasis que se ponía en algunas experiencias en el nuevo emprendimiento innovador y endógeno que se está originando en muchas áreas rurales, al menos aquí en Europa, y desde luego la pandemia de COVID-19 lo ha puesto todavía más de manifiesto, si cabe. Hay una tendencia creciente a plantearse desarrollar proyectos de vida y profesionales en el medio rural. Este nuevo ecosistema rural, que de alguna forma para nosotros viene a suponer una cierta esperanza para la revitalización de áreas rurales ya muy escasamente pobladas o muy frágiles, tiene además una fuerte componente de género. Está protagonizada en muchos casos, afortunadamente, por mujeres jóvenes profesionales que están cambiando las cosas, sobre todo en el ámbito de la economía social en el medio rural. ¿Cuál es el estado de cosas en Canadá a este respecto? ¿Y en qué medida los nuevos planteamientos del ente rural canadiense están recogiendo este fenómeno y lo están teniendo en cuenta?
Just so I'm clear, so are you seeing a counter-urbanization trend of people moving from urban to rural? No? Yes? So some people saying yes, some people saying no. Okay. And then young women, and primarily in the arts sector or entrepreneurial in general?
Emprendedoras en general, ¿no? Entrepreneurs.
Certainly the pandemic, we are seeing a very large urban to rural migration right now. Whether this is something that we're going to see long term is anyone's guess. But for a whole range of factors, there have been a number of cities where people are relocating to rural communities. At first, we were seeing it primarily communities that were still within the commuting zone of an urban center, so within that 2 to 3 hour range. But now we're seeing many people, they've termed them digital nomads here, so people who can take their work pretty much anywhere, looking to go further out from that 2 to 3 hour range. One province in particular, Nova Scotia, actually has a marketing campaign right now, which is trying to attract 15,000 people to migrate to their province this year. As part of this working from home. If you can work from home, you should work from a place you'd want to live in. So there's a lot of rural communities that are seeing the pandemic as an opportunity to try and attract people to their community for the lifestyle. But there are still issues with that in Canada. Access to broadband is a big one for a lot of our communities. So to be able to facilitate that working from home. In terms of entrepreneurship, I think some rural communities are seeing much more active entrepreneurs, particularly in the social sectors, revitalize their community. And it was one of the things that the Rural Secretariat did that I think was really innovative was they had those two projects, the Pilot Projects Initiative and the Model for Rural Development. And those were initiatives that encouraged stakeholders to partner together in a community and try out new ideas. And there were over in the first wave, I think in the pilot projects, there was something like 300 different pilot projects that were tried across the country on different topics, anything from helping train local rural counselors for municipal government to looking at how to get farms to compost on site, to looking at entrepreneurship and programs that could support. And so I think those types of programs where you can bring people together and try out new ideas is something that's really beneficial. I will say too, just as an aside, I am just wrapping up a project in partnership with the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, where we've been looking at the impacts of the pandemic on rural communities and some of the recommendations for recovery. We will likely have a report out in the next couple of weeks, and I can send that to Miguel to share with the larger group. And it's based on a survey that we did with local rural leaders across the country here in Canada to look at what the impacts were and then what tools they felt they needed for recovery. We also asked them to share with us stories of how either their local governments were responding to the pandemic in innovative ways, or how other organizations, whether it was businesses that were pivoting and retooling, or other organizations like volunteer organizations that stepped in to fill a gap. So we have over 100 case studies from across Canada of innovative examples that have been tried during the pandemic. So we can share that with you.
Muchas gracias por la respuesta. No sé si alguien más quiere tomar la palabra. No, bueno. Hay un...
Yo voy a preguntar.
Adelante, Ana.
Nada, es muy sencillo, que lo has mencionado tú, Miguel, un poco, pero me gustaría saber cómo habéis tenido en cuenta el enfoque de género, si es que se ha tenido, o si planteáis tenerlo, porque me imagino que, bueno, igual que aquí veo que tenemos muchas similitudes, me imagino que también las desigualdades de género serán bastante profundas en el medio rural. Eso.
I have not looked at gender in particular as part of my research. We do have a gender lens that is used at the federal government, so it's another lens that is applied. In the rural context, often, depending on where they are, women might be the ones who are driving a lot of the social sector. And so we have seen some research in that area, and I can connect you with some of the members in the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation who are very actively engaged looking at gender dynamics and women in rural life. I'm happy to connect you with some of them.
Sí, perfecto.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem.
Muy bien. ¿Más intervenciones? Bueno, si no es el caso, yo también quería ofrecer de alguna forma a la doctora Hall la posibilidad de que nos pregunte a nosotros acerca de la situación aquí en España y sobre cuestiones en las cuales eventualmente, ya que se ha prestado tan amablemente a colaborar enviándonos información y estudios, pues que le podamos contestar, ¿no?, a cualquier aspecto de su interés sobre la realidad en España y en la Unión Europea.
Certainly. I'm very curious to know whether you're hoping to have a rural lens or whether it's another type of initiative that you're hoping the government will implement there, and what brought about the interest in potentially trying a rural lens.
No sé si queréis que conteste yo o Alfred mismo, por ejemplo, como coordinador del estudio. Estamos preparando un informe, puesto que... Ya está, perdón. Bien, como digo, el propio sentido de este grupo tiene como finalidad la instauración de un sistema del ente rural en España. Decía que desde hace unos años en España se ha vivido una toma de conciencia muy fuerte acerca del deterioro, del declive demográfico y económico de muchas áreas rurales. Aunque España no tiene las dimensiones de Canadá, sin embargo, tiene unos fuertes contrastes en cuanto a la distribución de población. Es un país que tiene más de 8.000 municipios y de ellos la gran mayoría tiene una población baja y además están muy dispersos en el territorio. Hay una concentración en las áreas urbanas y en las zonas, digamos, de transición, en lo que en Canadá serían esas áreas no urbanas de menos de 100.000 o 300.000 habitantes, pero que desde luego pues tampoco tienen menos de 10.000. En definitiva, ahí es donde se concentra y ello ha generado una crisis en cuanto a la vertebración territorial, pero también en cuanto a la conciencia de nuestro pasado, de nuestro acervo cultural, de nuestra propia percepción del estilo de vida en el que vivimos y de la sensación de que hemos perdido una gran oportunidad de vivir más armoniosamente en nuestro territorio y gozando de él y aprovechando, ¿no?, las oportunidades que puede ofrecer. Como decimos, pues después de este debate se ha iniciado una serie de movimientos políticos, una estrategia nacional sobre el cambio demográfico, sobre el desafío demográfico. También a nivel de los gobiernos regionales se trabaja en mayor o menor medida, incluso en legislación, como la que acaba de aprobar hace muy pocos días la comunidad autónoma en la región de Castilla-La Mancha, y sin embargo vemos que no existe un mecanismo, una herramienta coherente, bien basada en la experiencia y en la investigación acerca de cómo orientar nuestras políticas y nuestras leyes de manera que no generen efectos perversos en áreas rurales que han desaparecido del imaginario de nuestros legisladores, que por lo tanto sufren más que se benefician de la cada vez más abundante normativa por la que nos regimos aquí y que proviene tanto de la Unión Europea como de la Administración Central y de las propias regiones. Este es el contexto. Por lo tanto, la respuesta es sí, nos estamos planteando, pero de momento desde la sociedad civil fundamentalmente, y es desde ella y a través de la elaboración de un informe que estamos ultimando, que recoge además un catálogo escogido de casos prácticos en los cuales se evidencia desde el nivel de la calle el impacto que tiene una legislación pensada a escala urbana. Y por lo tanto vamos a poner, esperamos, a nuestros legisladores en la situación de plantearse la forma en la que elaboran sus normas para que no tenga esos efectos indeseables. Este es el contexto y quiero pensar, y estoy convencido de ello, que la intervención que nos has ofrecido va a contribuir muy eficazmente a que acertemos en nuestra propuesta.
Great, thank you. And I would say too, if there isn't a strong knowledge of rural within whichever level of government is implementing this, or ideally would implement this, that's also one piece of the puzzle in addition to the rural lens. You need those people who are either from rural or very familiar with rural to be able to help coordinate and implement those tools. What we've found, I think, certainly in the Canadian context is often policy has now become almost a generalist profession, and they're no longer specializing in specific policy areas. And it's really important that people understand at its core what it's like to be in a rural community and what those realities are. So that, I think, is something to keep in mind as well, that it's the legislation, the tool, the evaluation, but also having the resources and the people who truly understand and can advocate on behalf of rural within government to really ensure that it's implemented effectively. I see we're coming up on our time, so I think if there's any more questions, I'm happy to answer, or feel free to email me anytime, and happy to chat via email as well.
De acuerdo, pues así lo haremos. Agradecemos el ofrecimiento. Como también agradecemos a la doctora Hall por todo lo que nos ha enseñado hoy, y a todos los asistentes, que esta vez no han sido muchos, pero que han hecho el esfuerzo de recoger estas sabias palabras, mágicas palabras, diría yo, por retomar mi comienzo. Y por supuesto agradecer a nuestra intérprete por su buen trabajo y por haber permitido facilitar nuestra comunicación desde las dos orillas del Atlántico. Muchísimas gracias, doctora Hall, y hasta bien pronto, espero.
Thank you, everyone. Great to meet you. Take care.
Adiós, adiós. Igualmente, cuidados.